Hello, I'm Janet Gordon, and I'm here to welcome all of you to a book talk about Genevieve Graham's book, The Forgotten Home Child. Welcome to viewers from across Canada. Our discussion today takes place in the Canadian provinces of Ontario and Nova Scotia, so I want to acknowledge the traditional First Nation and Métis owners and caretakers of these lands. In Toronto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And in Nova Scotia, in Mi'kmaq, the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Your hosts today are two Stephen Lewis Foundation Grandmothers to Grandmothers groups, the Bram Grahams of Brampton, Ontario, and the Old Orchard Blossoms of Toronto, of which I am a member. In the past 15 years, this organization has grown to be 10,000 grandmothers and grandmothers strong, mostly in Canada, but now including members in Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Grandmothers groups organize fundraising events and activities and act in solidarity with grandmothers raising their AIDS orphan grandchildren in sub-Saharan Africa. We thank you for joining us and request that you support this worthy cause as you are able. We are pleased to have with us today the author of The Forgotten Home Child, Genevieve Graham. Genevieve was raised and attended university here in Toronto, then lived in Calgary for some time, and has made her home in Nova Scotia since 2008. Before she turned to writing, Genevieve earned a Bachelor of Music Performance on the oboe, worked in advertising, marketing, and fundraising, taught piano, and raised two daughters. Since moving to Nova Scotia, she became interested in local history and began writing about it. This resulted in 5 books being published in 5 years. We look forward to hearing about her writing, especially The Forgotten Home Child, as well as a little about her newest novel, Letter Across the Sea. Welcome and thank you, Genevieve.
Thank you for having me, Janet.
Today's interviewer is another well-loved Canadian author, Jennifer Robson. Jennifer is an academic by background, a former editor by profession, and a lifelong history nerd. She is now a full-time writer. She's published 6 novels set during and after the 2 world wars. Many of you will be familiar with her bestseller, The Gown. Her most recent novel is called Our Darkest Night, a novel of Italy and the Second World War. Jennifer studied at Western University and the University of Oxford, where she obtained a doctorate in British economic and social history. She lives in Toronto with her husband and children and shares her home office with Ellie the sheepdog and her feline companion, Sam and Meekin. Welcome and thank you, Jennifer. Thanks to both of you. And now I'll pass the baton over to Jennifer.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Janet. That was both of those introductions were lovely. I think Genevieve and I are both, well, I still pinch myself when I think that this is my job, that I get to write and I get to talk to other writers and nerd out over history like every day. It's a dream come true.
And I'll go one step farther, Jennifer, because when I started seeing my books in stores, I was amazed that I was anywhere close to you, because you were there first, and I was a big admirer.
Well, and 2 of our earlier books, actually, and this is, I'm giving away kind of a bit of an insider secret in that a lot of covers for historical fiction rely on stock photography. They don't set up cover shoots just for one book. You know, if you're extraordinarily famous and sell millions of books, then they do. But for regular authors, there's these wonderful kind of libraries of stock photography, and we both both have one of our earlier books. It's was it Tides of Honor?
Yep.
Tides of Honor is your book, and After the War is Over for my book, and it was the same cover photograph. I think maybe a different pose, but it was the same couple. And I think that was the first time we connected.
I think so. It was reversed on the photo, I think, but mine was all ready to go. And then somebody showed me the catalog in Costco and said, that's Jennifer's book. That's Jennifer's book.
And they changed mine because they did not like, the Canada did not like the US cover, all of these things. And, you know, you can, but it's not the first time or the last that I've walked, you know, through a bookstore and thought, hey, that cover looks really familiar. So, you know, if I go back to our lovely introduction, you know, both of us, in a way, this is kind of our second or third life, you know, in terms of profession. And I just wanted to touch upon a little bit what led you to this. You know, in my case, I ended up writing because, you know, there was nothing much else I wanted to do. And I, you know, worked in magazines and journalism for a number of years, and it was fine. I didn't love it. And I had to go, and it worked out, which is kind of an unromantic way of putting it. But with you, what led you to you know, take on writing historical fiction, which wouldn't necessarily be the first choice of a lot of people. They might think, hey, I'll try a thriller or a mystery or something, but you went for historical fiction.
Oh boy, the idea of writing thriller or mystery just confounds me. I could never do that. I do not have the background that you have. I had never even considered going into writing until I was in my early 40s. And that all came from a love of reading historical fiction. I used to read everything, of course. When you're 16, everybody reads Stephen King, and then you go through Nora Roberts, and you go through James Patterson, and all through the major names. And I ended up one day when my daughters were I think they were about 4 and 6, and my mom came over and said, you know, you're spending so much time taking care of everybody else in this house, including the babies and the food and the husband and everything. Here's something that you used to love to do to feed your soul. And that was, she handed me a copy of Outlander. And that put me on the trail of reading absolutely everything historical fiction I could find, especially Scottish. Yeah. And I read everything. And then I thought, you know, I bet I could do some of this. Let's just see. And I just told my husband, I'm going to go downstairs to our one and only dial-up computer in the basement and see if I know what I'm doing at all. And a couple hours later, I brought it up, and he goes, that's not half bad. So you got to, right from there you couldn't stop me after that. And the historical fiction is just, it's so addictive once you get into writing it. And then writing Canadian has been a whole different angle. Oh, I love everything about it.
Yeah. Well, and I find too, for me, I mean, people I know read, certainly I read historical fiction for that feeling of being swept away to another time and place. I mean, it's as simple as that. But I also find when I'm writing it, it achieves the same aims, that I can put all of the anxieties of today, I mean, not out of my head, but maybe to the side, and focus on another time and place. And since I often write about the 2 world wars, as you've also done quite a lot, you know, I find it, do you find it puts things in perspective for you sometimes, especially if you've been having a crummy day?
It does. And just this summer, I was writing a little bit about the Spanish flu, because why not? And I just, it takes you away. It makes you forget, at least for a few hours, about what's going on. But for me, it's also a huge education thing, because I am not a historian. I've never known anything about history, slept through history, in fact. And then it wasn't until I was much older that I realized how little I actually knew. And now with reading historical fiction and writing it, there's so much to learn. And then for me, as soon as I've learned something, I need to dig even deeper. So it's exciting doing that.
Yeah. It's perpetually down the rabbit hole, right? You know, you find one little thing, you think, oh, you know, just a half hour segue from what I'm doing. And then I'll come up for air at the end of the day and think, not a lot of words on the page, but I know a lot about the history of who knows what it is, when they first started having menus in restaurants, or something completely obscure like that, which, you know, I always think, well, maybe if it's buried in here, I'll use it one day. Like that'll be really, really handy.
I think you've been spying on my computer today, because that's exactly what happened to me today.
Well, it's because it's those little things, and that's one of the things I love about your books, is that you know, I feel as if I'm eavesdropping on somebody's life when I'm reading them, because the details are there, and in the right proportions. I mean, nobody wants a laundry list of the contents of somebody's pantry in 1944, or you know, it's kind of a play-by-play of what they see as they walk down the street, down to the smallest blade of grass. But and then you can also go in the other direction too much, where there isn't enough, you know, detail to ground the reader in a sense of where they are. And I find I really enjoy, especially your most recent book. I live not far away from where part of it takes place. In that I did feel grounded in that particular moment, and I felt as if I could close my eyes and then open them and see the world as it was during the Second World War, or the late 1930s, and that the things you were showing me belonged, right? But that's not as easy to do as I'm making it sound. Like what kind of process do you go through to find all those details,
Well,
to anchor your stories?
first of all, thank you very much. That's huge coming from you. I feel the same with yours. I feel like I'm actually in there. I think what leads to that is the same as what we've just talked about, is going down that rabbit hole. Because while we don't want to have a list of things, we do want to have that list of things, right?
Yeah.
We need to know them all, so that if our character needs it, then we will have it, whether they want it or not. We were talking about Tides of Honor, and the day after the Halifax explosion, which is what that book is about, there was a huge blizzard. And I knew when I was researching how many inches of snow fell. I knew the air temperature. I knew the number of dead. I knew everything had happened. But all my character knew was that the snow was falling into his boots, and that he needed a blanket. He was freezing cold. So I think that, as you know, that what brings us into the story and connects us to the characters is that once we know enough history and those little tiny details, then we are actually part of the cast. We can become those characters. We can see what they're doing. I like to think about Winnie. If she was walking along the street and she looks at a store, I have to know what she sees in that window, and then I have to see how much everything in that window costs, and which one she's going to buy and how she's going to use it. And all of that comes from diving down those rabbit holes. And I'm sure you do too. I'm not very organized. So I have written a lot of things that in the end don't need to be written, but they do need to be researched. And I think that's what brings it all to life, because for us, it's all about not just educating, but bringing in the emotion, and you have to connect to those characters enough that it really matters.
I feel as if, in a way, the historian, or the brain of a historian and a historical fiction writer, we're almost like the proverbial iceberg, in that you're only seeing, you know, the bit that's here that shows up in the book, but there's all of the kind of the hidden weight, really, of what we've ingested and tried to memorize and tried to kind of keep at the back of our minds, just as much so that we can pull it out when we need it, but also because I feel as if even the things that don't make it onto the page inform my development of the characters. As you say, the emotional weight of what they're going through, how they would react to things. You know, it's that search for authenticity that I think we're always trying for, and it can be elusive, especially, you know, there's some days it's really elusive, and I don't know, like, my remedy is sometimes just to go back to the source material and do a bit more reading and see if I can find what I'm looking for there. Is that what you try? How do you go about it?
When you're stuck, you mean? Well, I just, I'll be going through every single source I can find and checking and double checking and triple checking. But if I really get stuck, then I will move on. I'll move on to a whole different section. And sometimes I'll find, sometimes I can go back to it and pull it up again and research that whole thing, and it works this time. But sometimes I'll get to the next part and I'll think, actually, I didn't need that. anyway. So I just spent an entire day trying to dig for something that I didn't need. So
Yeah.
you never know what's important. I think
Well, and the horrors of things vanishing in the editorial stage, where chapters of books that have taken, I feel as if that they can be measured in the pints of blood, really, and those disappear into effectively the cutting room floor. But I always hold on to those bits, just because I never know whether I'm going to come back to that the place and time, and maybe I'll need a little scene of set in a restaurant with the details of what people are eating, and it may not have made it into book A, but maybe a version of it might show up along the line.
I have all sorts of files of deleted things, whether they're chapters or whole sections or little parts. But I keep telling myself I'll use them for the next book if I need to. I haven't dug into them that often, but what I have done is share deleted chapters on my website. Yeah. And that's fun to do, because then you can see, what that character might have said, which you didn't read in the book. That's kind of fun for the readers, and it's kind of fun for me. I don't write love scenes, but I did include a deleted one on my page because I thought, well, I don't feel like it belongs in the book, but I did want to explore it. So it's over there.
Yeah. I have actually a deleted love scene from my first book it was certainly not racy. I mean, it was not especially spicy at all, but it was just a little too much for the book. And so my editor very delicately suggested we take it out. And I've held on to it. And again, I've looked at it since then and thought, well, it really wasn't that too much, right? It wasn't as if it came out of a very explicit book or anything. And then I've toyed with putting it up on my website, and then I thought, well, I didn't know, there might be some readers who wouldn't be super happy about that. Before we go too long, what I want to talk about too is your focus, which I love, on Canadian history. Now I find what I get a lot from Canadian readers, because I haven't written a book that is focused on Canada. I've had so far my one Canadian character who appeared in a gown, but nothing has been set entirely in Canada or focused on aspects of Canadian history. And there are moments I feel a little defensive, well, why are you asking me this? Is there something wrong? I justify it because my background is in British and European history, and that's where I feel comfortable. But what led you specifically? Because you talked earlier about how you were interested in writing about Scottish history. What turned you away from there to Canadian history as your focus?
Well, from what I remember in history class in Toronto, I learned all about the American history and British history. Mm-hmm. And I learned about the War of 1812, and I learned the Plains of Abraham, and that's all I can really remember about it. And then I went along in my life and didn't think anything of it. And as you say, went into Scottish history and learned tons about that. Very exciting stuff. But when my family and I moved out to Nova Scotia in 2008, all of a sudden I was surrounded by houses, like abandoned 150-year-old houses, and cemeteries that have generation after generation of tombstones. They've been living there forever. And of course, there are the cemeteries here that are filled with the dead from the Titanic and from the Halifax explosion. Mm-hmm. And what did it for me was I had never heard of the Halifax explosion. And everybody here in Nova Scotia went, "You what? You don't know what?" Yeah. And I sort of was, a little embarrassed by that until I started asking some of my friends anywhere west of Nova Scotia. And most of them had no idea either. And I thought, well, that's just wrong, because we do have history here. We just don't talk about it. Yeah. And I'm not exactly sure why. Like, one of my novels is set in the Klondike Gold Rush with the Mounties. What could be more exciting than that? And that's Canadian history. So once I started writing it with the Halifax explosion, I couldn't stop. And actually, Letters Across the Sea is my 6th, and there's 3 more on the go. So there's always Canadian stories, and it's fun.
Well, because I think the problem is that, and I was lucky. I had a couple of really, really terrific history teachers in school, and then my dad taught history as a professor at Trent for many years, and so it was in the air. But so history generally, I never thought was boring. And I certainly never thought Canadian history was boring, but certainly in the way it was taught, and is still often taught in the curriculum, can be, shall I say, a little dry. And it's as if it deliberately focuses on the things that are not especially interesting and leaves all the really fascinating stories kind of by the wayside. And sometimes I just want to just shake my head at the way history is presented to students, because it's as if it gives them no choice but to think it's boring, especially Canadian history, when it's not.
Wow.
We're a country of adventurers and
We are.
and pioneers, in the sense that people who've left one place and come to another with nothing, and that in itself is fascinating. But even
Yeah.
the history of Canada and the two world wars, I think is among the most, in terms of, if you look at various nations that fought in those wars, what Canadians did, both on the battlefield and on the home front, is incredible. And you're one of the few people telling those stories.
It's funny, isn't it? We just don't talk a lot about ourselves. We tend to apologize for ourselves. But yeah, and I love looking at Canadian military history whenever I can. In The Forgotten Home Child, I did the Battle of Sicily, which I thought was fascinating, because when the battle happened, we were surrounded, the Canadian troops were surrounded by the Americans and the British, and everyone talks about their role in it. But people don't talk about the fact that the Germans were actually noting the dangerous snipers. They called them the mountain boys from Canada, and they were actually making the Germans nervous. And in my new book, talking about the Battle of Hong Kong, about the men who had to defend Hong Kong and ended up in a horrible situation out there, all this military history from right here, and why don't we talk about it? It's like what you were saying before, because with when I was in history class, when I was actually paying attention, I remember listening to the War of 1812 and the Plains of Abraham. But can you tell me one time when you were listening to a class and you heard about over 120,000 destitute children being sent from England to Canada to work as indentured servants? Like, why isn't that taught? These were, when you say pioneers, these were some of our youngest pioneers ever, and we don't know anything about it. This book was an amazing discovery for me, and I actually felt really, really, well, nervous at first and surprised, because I hadn't read anything else about it, and I didn't understand that. I thought somebody must have explored this, and there are books that are nonfiction. There are books about the home children that were based on specific children, all of them nonfiction, but I hadn't read very many that were fiction and that were actually accessible to readers of fiction. So I loved writing this book, and I love everything it's done.
Well, tell me, what was the aha moment that just, was it? I've had moments where the idea for a book kind of unspools really slowly over months and months, and then I've also had experiences where it feels like an anvil has fallen out of the sky. And I'm getting the feeling that with this book, it was the anvil that fell out of the sky and just made you go, like, there's nothing else that I can do except write this book.
It was no choice. I ran across it in 2017. I ran across an article somewhere, and I thought, oh, look at these children. And then, oh, look at these children were sent here. Well, that's something we need to learn about. So I knew right away I had to write about it, but finding the story within it is always a whole different challenge. So what I did was try and focus on 5 different children and build each one of them, give each one of them a different kind of experience. And when I studied I had so many experiences in my research that I wanted to share. And so I wove them into those characters to make them come alive. My favorite part about research for this book was that I always do, I'm sure as you do, I go to the library and I take out all the big nonfiction, heavy, dry old books, and then I read as much as I can. Then I go online and I cruise everywhere. But it was when I came across the British Home Children Advocacy and Research Association, who sent me to their Facebook page, that everything came alive, because the Facebook page is held by thousands of descendants of the children who have 2 goals. One is to introduce people to their ancestors. Give us the information and we will connect you to the right person's records. and the other is to educate. So when I popped on there and said, so I kind of want to write a book, they were all on board.
Yeah.
And when I put a survey online for them, I thought I might get a couple of answers. The first page was basically, name and date of birth and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But the second page was, what do you remember about your ancestor? What stories do you know? What adjective would you use to remind them? Things like that. And I thought I'd get, a couple of responses, but within 1 week I had over 200. And it just shows you, they're so eager to teach. And so once I had all their answers and the true stories of these children, that's when it all came crashing in. And I thought, okay, all of my children in the book will have experienced what actually happened because of the, the authentic stories of these ancestors and the descendants. So it was, I think the aha, there were two of them, because the first one came with, I am writing this no matter what it is. And the second one was, oh, now I see how I'm going to write it. And it was so exciting. And when that happens, it just gives you chills. You just know your whole being kind of changes direction. And, oh, wow, this is what I am for the next how many months that you're writing. And
well, when you fall into the gold mine, right? Like, when you're writing historical fiction, so often you're working with crumbs. Like, there's just so little to work with. And then in the rare occasion that this pot of gold of information opens up, I mean, I think that's just confirmation that you were destined to write a particular story. Now, were you prepared though? Because I can't remember how many weeks that it sat at number one. This was last year when it came out.
Yeah.
And I, writers, we take some delight in seeing our friends on the bestseller lists, and it was lovely. Week after week after week, you were there at number one on the Canadian fiction lists, and I mean, it resonated with Canadian readers. Were you surprised that it's 16 weeks? Is that how long it was sitting at number one? It felt like that.
It was on the list for 19, but it was number one for 11.
11.
11 wonderful, glorious weeks. I was surprised. I mean, you can't really predict anything like that, but in a way I wasn't, because it was such amazing confirmation, because it tells me again, not only that Canadians do want to know about our history, but they wanted to learn about these children. And they've determined that about 12% or over 4 million Canadians are descended from these kids. But because the kids never told their story, for the most part, they don't even know about it. So when they started buying these books and buying it, I was like, well, this is teaching so many people. And all of a sudden I was receiving letters and messages and emails from people that I'd never heard of before. And I mean, I've received letters before, and it's wonderful every time anything comes in. These ones were flooding in, and they were making me cry like crazy. Everything about this book makes you cry. So it was, I was reading these stories that just broke your heart. I had one email from a woman in November of last year, and she had asked me to send her 3 signed copies for herself, for her sister, and her cousin, and dedicated to their great-great-grandfather. And I was happy to do that. And she said, we've had problems between our families, but I just read your book, and I think we figured out a few things. We've been doing our genealogy. We found a 6-year-old little boy in Halifax Harbor, and we were like, where did he come from and where did he go? They lost track of that person who was in their line. So I sent out the 3 books, and 2 weeks later I heard from her cousin, who said that learning about who their great-grandfather was through reading my book, and then going and researching more through the descendants, has changed their family's life. That for generations, they've had alcoholism and abuse and all sorts of basically intergenerational trauma, similar to the residential school system, in that the great-grandfather was never shown any love, and he didn't know how to pass it on. So she was saying that the book, or discovering the book, and then the research following, was healing their family. And it's happening to a lot of families. So that was something I did not expect. And something, yes, it was very,
getting a little choked up, because it's those moments we live for, right? I think you probably agree. I mean, bestseller lists are wonderful. They're wonderful. Nobody ever complains about them. But I think a reader, a letter, email, or message from a reader saying that the book we've written has affected them for the better, or what I mean, that's actually beyond I mean what most of us ever get. The idea that your book has started to help a family heal is incredible.
That was way beyond what I could have hoped. And I mean, at first it was a little bit scary realizing what a responsibility this book now had, but knowing that everything I had said was true and that everything that was in the book actually did happen to each child, it was authentic, and the fact that it was able to reach them and help them, I don't know, it's changed my life too. And it's hard to follow up after that for sure.
Yeah. Now, have people been asking you? I know for a handful of my books, certainly, I get people asking, and I take the question in the spirit in which it's offered. They ask for sequels, and I've written linked books. I've never written anything that's a straight sequel. Have you been under some pressure to revisit even just the broader subject of the home children?
A few people have asked, and some of them want continuations of the individual children's stories.
Yeah.
But I think we're done with that story for now.
Yeah.
We've put it to bed. On to the next. There's a lot of important stories.
So tell me about your, because so you know what, we'll come back to your new book, which I absolutely loved, and I think my quote is somewhere on the cover there. But you were also talking about some other works in progress, which had my ears wiggling. Are there any you feel you can talk about a little bit? I know, like, typically with if you're a few books out, you never want to say anything out loud. Just it's best to keep ideas close to yourself. But
well, I can tell you that the one for next spring is going to be based around Prohibition era, and so it'll be it's going to be set around Windsor, Ontario, as well as in the First World War. And it's going to be because the Windsor-Detroit funnel was the busiest across Canada since Michigan went dry first. Yeah, and so Windsor took full advantage of that. It's an exciting story. It's a completely different story from the Home Children, obviously, but it's got its little share of Peaky Blinders in there. It's fun, it's active, and I'm really looking forward to that. The one for the next year, I'm going to keep a little bit quiet.
Yeah, I know that my book that's 2 books out, I can't even tell anyone, not even my editor. I feel I have to do some percolating before I can talk anymore. So this book we also want to talk about, which is actually it was an instant bestseller. And when I say instant bestseller, last week, it had been on sale for one day before the Toronto Star and Globe and Mail finalized their numbers for the bestseller list. So one day of sales, and it popped it into number 3, right? The 3rd spot, which is a big deal. So this was just a delicious book. I love this cover. I know there's a very different cover for the United States, which is lovely. I don't know. I love this one. There's something about the red and the shoes that's quite lovely. So our mutual friend, Kate Quinn, who is just, well, if you're reading this and you like historical fiction, I don't have to tell you who Kate Quinn is. So Kate has said it's a tender, moving tale illuminating a fascinating and lesser known chapter of World War II history. And then my quote, which I wrote months and months ago. I think I read this in manuscript form. It wasn't even at the galley stage. I always look forward to diving into a Genevieve Graham novel because I know I'll be swept away. In Letters Across the Sea, she sends us from 1930s Toronto, then under siege by a relentless plague of anti-Semitism, to a different battleground altogether, the last stand of Canadian troops at the Battle of Hong Kong. This is history worth remembering and fiction that both enlightens and entertains. That's not a bad blurb.
Very nice blurb.
I obsess over blurbs, I have to say, because especially if the writer's a friend, that's important, but also if the book is tremendously good, which this is. And so just to give everyone who's listening a little peek at this lovely book, did you want to we'll talk a little bit about your inspiration for it, and then just a little peek without any spoilers of what people
Yeah, well, I wanted to write, it's always going to be about Canadian history. And so I wanted to write, this one was, it started off about the Christie Pitts riot, which was, it was called the largest ethnic riot in Canadian history. Took place in 1933 in downtown Toronto, where anti-Semitism was running rampant, which who knew about that? Like we didn't know any of that had happened, that there were signs in the stores that said, help wanted, Jews need not apply. And there were gangs wandering the street called swastika clubs who were beating up Jewish people, and the Jewish people had their own gangs, and things were getting rough. And it was in August 33 that there was a baseball game with thousands of people watching. And at the very end of the game, somebody unfurled a huge banner with a swastika in the middle, and the crowd went wild. And some of them had shown up with sawed off iron pipes and bricks and bats. And there were over 10,000 people fighting for over 4 hours. So that was what I wanted to write about. So I did. And then I was like, well, but that's not finished yet. There's that rabbit hole, right? I was thinking, but wait a second, I'm not done. And I knew that my main character, Max, wanted to go to war because he was a very strong, courageous Jewish man, and he wanted to stand up for his people and do what was right. But he ended up with the forces that were sent, the garrison forces that were sent to Hong Kong on garrison duty, never supposed to fight, and were caught up in the Battle of Hong Kong when the Japanese invaded Hong Kong, which people said was never going to happen. And they eventually met on Stanley Field and in the last stand of the Canadians. There were over 260 men killed during the battle. But here's the thing about the Battle of Hong Kong is that it was the only battle in World War II history that was 100% a failure. Because if they didn't die out there, they were taken as POWs by the Japanese for the next 3 years and 10 months, which was starvation and brutality and slave labor. And when they finally came back here, they were basically invisible. Nobody wanted to talk about them. So another part of our history that I thought needed to be told, needed to be talked about. And there are only 5 of these men still alive, and every one of them matters, and they all deserve the respect that I'm trying to give them in this book. So
we don't like to, it's interesting as Canadians, we we'll talk reasonably readily about things like the Battle of Vimy Ridge and so our great successes, or Juno Beach. But we don't love talking about the moments where, and it wasn't that our soldiers, I should always add, or our sailors were unsuccessful. It's where they were placed against unwinnable odds. But we don't talk about Dieppe very much. And we certainly don't talk about the Battle of Hong Kong or what happened to Canadian POWs in those long months after their capture. And again, it's as if not only do we want to sweep aside all the interesting bits of history, I say we, but just broadly speaking, that's what happens. It's as if the bits of Canadian history that make people uncomfortable also get swept aside.
That's very true. Very, very true.
Yeah, and including again the anti-Semitism in Toronto at that time. I mean, I walk by Christie Pitts all the time. It's just a dog, like a park where people walk their dogs and kids run around, and you'd never really think that something like that happened.
And so when you're at Christie Pitts next time, and take a look at the plaque, because I think as historical fiction authors, that's what we're trying to fix. We take a plaque like that, and that nobody ever reads it. People walk past it 1,000 times in their lifetime, never really think about what it was. So we take that plaque and we bring it to life. I think that's what we as historical fiction authors do. And I love doing it in my home country, but all over the world, like you do it so beautifully, all over World War II. Your latest one in Italy,
well,
that was fantastic.
It's finding those corners that have been forgotten, and the people too, the people who've been forgotten. I mean, do we need yet another biopic about Churchill and May 1940? I mean, not that I don't want to watch it, it's interesting, but what about ordinary people trying to get through the war? Just ordinary soldiers.
Mhm.
Not Montgomery at El Alamein. Again, we've heard plenty about his story, but what about just ordinary enlisted men? Or where my interest lies quite often is it's the women who went into service in these wars, and what did they experience? What were the obstacles thrown in front of them? And then what happens to them afterwards? I think the answer, of course, we know is that their service all too often was overlooked. But those are those hidden corners of history that I feel, and I know you feel this, like it's almost like an obligation. We may not be teaching history in a classroom, but in some ways I feel as if I have more access to share stories, to teach using these books than I ever would if I were just standing in front of a classroom, a smaller classroom. I mean, it's exciting, but I also feel an obligation.
Yeah. And I think it's because of how we write it. If we were to write, because people have said to me, why do you call it historical fiction if it's true story? Well, because it's not nonfiction. If I wrote nonfiction, I couldn't be filling out these characters and using dialogue and doing things that I do. But I think because of how we mold that nonfiction into real emotional stories that make an impact on people, we're doing what I think is that we are teaching the mind while we touch the heart at the same time, so they'll never forget those histories.
Yeah.
So
it may not be literally true, but it could have been true. That's the whole point. Is it plausible enough, these stories that we create, that they could be true?
yes.
And in because of those possibilities, that's how we're able to take our readers and kind of just drop them down into another time and place. Now,
Mhm.
I feel as if what I should do is wrap up my questioning, because you have some incredible materials to share about the Forgotten Home Child,
Mhm.
which I think everyone watching will be really excited to see.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jennifer. That was
Thank
great.
you.
I
That was
love,
a lot of fun. I know we could talk for 3 more hours,
and we probably will another time.
but everyone here's just signed up for an hour, so I'm going to hand it over to you and watch with great interest.
Okay, and let's see if I can do this sharing screen properly, because I was messing it up earlier. But I think this is going to work. All right, good. Good.
Yay.
So, in the years following the Industrial Revolution, tens of thousands of people survived in abject poverty on the filthy, violent streets of London, Liverpool, Glasgow, and others. The popular refrain of the day was that they needed to clean up the streets of all the destitute, suffering children, who they called the gutter rats. And so this was a popular cartoon of the day that would run in the papers, and shows them shoveling those children into the back of a truck. And yes, the streets were filthy and sick, and they probably weren't going to have a very happy life there anyway, but this just shows the way they thought of the children back then. Dr. Bernardo was one of, there were a number of philanthropic organizations that stepped forward to take the children in when they found them living on the streets that way, giving them food, shelter, clothing, and education in the trades. The largest and best known of these was Dr. Thomas Bernardo, and his organization is still around today. And he pledged no destitute child ever refused admission. You can see that over the top of his door. And his organization was eventually responsible for sending over 30,000 children to Canada. So this was his first home that he opened, on Stepney Causeway in London for boys. And inside them, they were taught the trades. For example, this is one of the carpentry classes. Among the many products the children learned to build, there was carpentry, boot making, etc. All the proceeds went back to the organization. And part of that was these wooden trunks that feature so prominently in the story of the Forgotten Home Child, because they did build their own, which they carried with them when they were shipped to Canada. This is a basic picture that I've seen everywhere whenever I look up the British home children. Over 120,000 children, some people say 130,000, were shipped from England to Canada between 1869 and 1948. And despite what some people say, only 2% of the children were actually orphans. Many of them, a great deal of them, were sent away without their parents' knowledge. One of the alarming things that I see in this photograph is how few adults there are. And it really is a sign of things to come, of how little supervision these children had. When it came to sending the children out, there was very little regard for sending them out in families or with siblings. These are two sisters. They were twins, actually, Marjorie and Mabel. They were fraternal twins that were sent away but separated from each other upon arrival. And here's the really, really, well, unfortunate part, terrible tragedy of their experience over there, was that they were reunited 55 years later or 60 years later. By this point, Marjorie had Alzheimer's and she didn't remember her twin at all. So it's really, it was very, at least they got to see each other, people said, but they didn't know who they were. So the tragedy was definitely very real throughout their whole lives. So I think that we have someone here, Catherine Richardson, who would like to talk a little bit about her paternal grandmother, excuse me, Eleanor Coughlin. You had a story to share about her, right?
Yes, I do. Do you have her photo?
Yes, I do. I just forgot to share it. Let me just grab that right now for you. All right. Sorry about that. So she is the one on the right. Am I right?
The one on the lady on the far right is my paternal grandmother. I'd like to thank both of you authors for a tremendous job. I met Jennifer Robson at a book talk at Young and Shepherd at the North York Library regarding the book, The Gown. And Genevieve, I want to thank you sincerely for bringing this topic into a historical fiction setting where many, many people will enjoy it. The lady in the middle is my mother, would be my paternal grandmother's daughter-in-law. And the lady on the left is my Aunt Mary, who is the youngest child in the family, and she is still alive. So I just wanted to tell you about my grandmother. My name is Catherine Coughlin, and I'm a member of the Old Orchard Blossoms grandmother group. I have been so excited to listen to this conversation, as my paternal grandmother was a home child. When Eleanor was 3 years old and her brother was 5, they were put in care because their mother was ill and their father could not cope. They were sent to 2 different orphanages, and 4 years later, the Catholic Emigration Society transferred them and 5 other children to Canada aboard the Empress of Britain. Unlike most home children, they ended up in a Catholic orphanage in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. When Eleanor was 18, she married Thomas Coughlin, a local farmer, and they had 7 children, although 1 died in infancy. Tragedy happened in 1932 when Thomas died from a heart attack. My grandmother, who was just 32 years old, had to sell the farm and move to Humboldt, Saskatchewan, where she raised 6 children all on her own. With faith and help from the Catholic Church, she raised 6 wonderful children who all became upstanding human beings. Just like Winnie, she never spoke about her early life, but I am proud to be related to her, such a strong woman, and I'm very happy to share her middle name. Below is a link if anyone is interested in donating to the Stephen Lewis Foundation. And I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us today in this lovely scenario. Thank you very much.